Welcome to this introduction to the joy of Bible study. There has never been a better time to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. So blessed is the person whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So let's begin. Can the Bible be trusted? Well, I'd like to offer you three sources of validation. The first one is its internal, the Bible's own internal validation, that it has one internally consistent theme. Secondly, the historical validation. In other words, the Bible has proven itself to be extremely accurate, historically accurate. And then the third one is the archaeological validation, that in fact the Bible is the world's only living archaeology. So let's go into these in a little bit more detail. Let's begin with the internal validation, that there's one consistent theme from start to finish, and that is God's restoration plan. That from Genesis to Jesus, everything revolves around the messianic hope. And there are three aspects to this messianic hope. First of all, the messianic promises. For instance, the promise to Abraham that through him and his descendants he will become a great nation, and that through him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That was the promise. And then there are other promises. For instance, a blessing to Judah, that the scepter will not depart from the tribe of Judah. And we'll look at that in more detail during the introduction to the Bible. Promises, for instance, to David that his throne would be established forever. And then the messianic prophecies. For instance, the suffering Messiah in Isaiah 53. Beautiful, beautiful chapter on pointing to Jesus and his suffering on the cross for our sin, for our redemption. And then the prophecies about, for instance, the branch in both Isaiah and in Jeremiah that point again to Jesus, a branch of Judah. And then the messianic types, and there are plenty of them. So for instance, the bronze snake in the wilderness. Here we find while the Israelites were in the wilderness, just after their escape from Egypt, there was a plague of snakes. And the snakes bit a whole lot of people, and a whole lot of people, Israelites, died. And God said to Moses, make a bronze snake and put it on a pole, and anyone who is bitten by the snake, if they look at the pole, they'll be saved. They won't die. And that is a direct type. Now, let's understand this. To the Jews, this is a story of a miracle that happened in the wilderness as part of their Exodus story. It's just a story of a miracle. That's it. There's nothing further. It only finds its real relevance in Jesus Christ and his death on the cross. So him being put on the pole, the snake represented the thing that was killing the Jews. So the Bible tells us that Christ became sin for us, and that by looking at Christ, just by faith in Christ's death and resurrection, we are saved from the penalty of sin. And so in the same way that by faith people were saved from the venom of the snakes. So the Bible has a specific purpose. It's God's revelation to humanity. And quite frankly, the internal validation is the only validation that has been available to God's people for millennia. And it's only been in the last 100 to 150 years that in fact the historical and archaeological validation have come into their fullness as people have explored. And I mean, that really began with Napoleon and his conquest of Egypt. So now we come to the historical validation and just briefly explore the historical accuracy of the Bible, because time and time again the Bible has proven itself to be historically accurate. Now, today, many people will assert that the Bible is a whole bunch of myths and fables. Well, that finds its roots in an 18th century school of biblical criticism. It was called higher criticism. And it questioned the historical accuracy of the Bible. And that school, or the consequence of that school, has persisted in universities and academic circles purely to discredit the Bible. For example, they argued that Moses couldn't have written the Pentateuch because writing didn't exist. Well, that was easy to say in 1700, a little bit more difficult in 1800, and impossible in the 1900s. Because in 1905, we discovered the Proto-Sinaitic, actually the world's first alphabet in Sinai. And that actually is ancient Hebrew, as you'll see just now. We then know through cuneiform tablets that writing has existed as far back as 3,500 BC. That's 5,500 years ago. So those early higher critics were disproved by later discoveries. They then also argued that the Hittite kingdom did not exist because they had no evidence of the Hittites anywhere. But a lack of evidence is not evidence of no evidence. It simply means there's a lack of evidence. And because in 1835, an explorer stumbled upon the ruins of Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. But it was only in 1876, when they began to dig into the mound, that they discovered that it was the capital of the Hittite Empire. And thirdly, and this is quite a fun one, they argued that Belshazzar didn't exist because the last king of Babylon was Nabonidus. And so they pointed out an error in the book of Daniel, that because Daniel reports Belshazzar as the king of Babylon when Babylon was conquered by the Medes and the Persians. So you're probably familiar with the story of the writing on the wall. And this writing terrifies Belshazzar while he's having this feast. And he says, "Whoever can interpret this writing, I will make them the third in the kingdom." So that's an interesting one, the third in the kingdom, because it turns out that Nabonidus was in fact the last king of Babylon. But he didn't live in Babylon. He was actually spent 10 years on campaign in Arabia. And he was based actually in Arabia. And his son, Belshazzar, was his regent. And we know that through a prayer cylinder that was discovered in Babylon, where he prays for his son, Belshazzar. And so that was discovered in 1835. And Belshazzar was his co-regent, and the best position that he could offer, because he was a co-regent, would be the third position in the kingdom. So the Bible is history from God's perspective, his story, not just a human history. It's history from God's perspective. And I love this example as a representation of the historical accuracy of the Bible. So let's begin with the archaeological validation. So an example is, and I love this example, it's, did the Exodus happen? So you'll find that secular Egyptologists such as Bob Breyer, who'd written a course, one of the great courses, called The History of Ancient Egypt. He's a professor at New York University. And they will argue, no, it didn't happen. And he says there is virtually no evidence for an Exodus. Maybe a trickle of Jews left Egypt at the time, and they embellished the story. And so these Egyptologists argue that since Exodus 1:11 says that the Israelites built Pithom and Ramses, the Exodus must have happened during the time of Ramses the Great. But let's have a look at the two different stories. So there's what's called an early date, the biblical date, and the second one is called the late date, a 13th century. So the early date is the 15th century, the late date is the 13th century. So dating back from the building of the temple, in 1 Kings 6 begins with saying, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So that's very specific. 480 years after Solomon began to build the temple. And that was in 966 BC. So add the two together, 966 plus 480, and you get 1446 BC. 1446 BC. That's the date that the Bible gives. Very specific. Okay, so how does this compare to the modern scholarship? For instance, what does Bob Breyer say in the history of ancient Egypt? Who is the pharaoh at that time in 1446? Well, we can find Amenhotep II, 1453 to 1419. So he's the pharaoh. But how do we know that he's the pharaoh? And I find this fascinating. So Bob Breyer argues for a 13th century Exodus, if it ever happened. But taking directly from his notes, related to Amenhotep's heir, who was Tutmosis IV, who reigned from 1419 to 1386. And he writes in his notes, he says his claim to the throne was probably weak. And the reason for this is a record that Tutmosis IV wrote on what was called the Dream Stealer at the Sphinx. So he loved hunting and all sorts of sports, and he did these around the area of the pyramids. And one day he had a nap between the paws of the Sphinx. And what he dreamt was that it was a promise. Horus appeared to him and said, if you clear the sand from around the Sphinx, you will become the pharaoh. So in other words, he wasn't first in line to be the pharaoh, but if he cleared the sand away from the Sphinx, he would become the pharaoh. And so we ask ourselves, if he wasn't first in line, who was first in line, and what happened to them? And then we have a look, if Amenhotep is the pharaoh of the Exodus, what happened to him that caused him to allow the Israelites to leave Egypt? Because they were slaves. So what caused him to allow the Israelites to escape? Well, you probably heard of the 10 plagues. And you might remember that the last plague was the death of the firstborn child in all of Egypt, whether it was, and it says, from the Pharaoh to the slave girl, the firstborn child is going to die, and of all of the animals. And so on the night of the Passover that is celebrated by the feast of the Passover, is that on that night, the angel of death passed through Egypt, and the firstborn in the whole kingdom of Egypt died. And so this is just a little clue, and there are lots of them, just a little clue that Tutmosis IV wasn't the first in line to Amenhotep's throne. And then we have the conquest of Canaan, which now happens 40 years after the Exodus from Egypt. And it's a period between 1406 and 1003 BC. And here we find references, quite a lot, about 300 of these tablets, of which are probably over 200 refer to what was happening in Canaan. And so the Canaanite kings in Canaan were vassals of the Egyptian king. And so they're writing letters to the Egyptian king, the Egyptian pharaoh, saying, come and help us. We're being invaded by these Apiru, these vagabonds. They're invading us and they're demolishing our cities. Come and help us. And the Egyptian pharaoh is just not listening. So there are plenty of these letters pleading for help, but they're not receiving the help that they wanted. And then we have a really interesting thing, and this is also from Bob Breyer, is a reference to the Merneptah stela. And this is dated around about 1207 BC. And Bob Breyer writes here that there's a determinative hieroglyph on the stela that indicates that Israel is a people and not a place. And so his conclusion that in 1207 the Israelites were still wandering in the wilderness. No, this is slap bang in the middle of the conquest period while the Israelites were conquering Canaan. And they were not a kingdom yet, they were still a people. They hadn't done the job. And in fact, this 1207 is right in the middle of the Bronze Age collapse, when the sea people were invading the Mediterranean. They'd come through Greece, they were invading the Levant, and a little while later they were going to invade Egypt. And one of these groups of people were called the Peshilet, and they became, in fact, the Philistines. If you read the book of Joshua, the tribe of Judah actually conquer the cities along the coast, Gaza, Ashkelon, etc. But the Merneptah stela is saying that Israel are no more, because these Peshilet have come in and they've pushed Israel out of this area, and they've established themselves on the sea coast. And so these are the sea people attacking Israel. But the key thing here from Bob Breyer's notes is that Israel is a people and not a place. His conclusion that they're wandering in the wilderness is wrong. The truth is that they were still the separate tribes all trying to conquer Canaan and actually not doing a very good job of it. And then the third one is that the kingdom of Israel was only established after David became king. He had ruled 7 years as the king of Judah from 1010 BC to 1003 BC. And in 33 years, he was the king of Israel, all the tribes of Israel. So let's look at how we approach the Bible. And I'm going to encourage you to be intellectual, but not an intellectual. And here's the distinction that I'd like to make. To be intellectual is to be curious, to be humble, and to be diligent, to be a seeker of truth, and to be willing to change your opinion based on what you discover. An intellectual is someone who is proud, confident in their opinions, and inflexible, and particularly inflexible if they've written a book or a couple of books on the topic. And so, in other words, an intellectual is an expert, and their position doesn't change easily. So there are two nice passages in the Bible. In Corinthians first, if anyone thinks they stand firm, beware, take heed, lest they fall. And they became futile in their thinking. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. So don't be a fool. Be open to the truth and follow the evidence wherever it leads.